Jack and Roxanne aren't available today. Jack's got a award that they're going to get today, so they've asked me to do the Q&A. Today's talk is going to be on law and justice.
Sometimes people ask, what are you going to do with the criminals? Well, I don't recognize a criminal. I think they're produced by society. I think they're people brought up in great disadvantage, economic disadvantage. And there are some people who start out with economic disadvantage, make a lot of money, and then steal more money to add to their security. I would say they were overstressed prior to becoming very wealthy. And they figured if a man is a sucker enough to lose his wealth, they'll take it away from him. They have a lot of statements like that too. A sucker is born every minute. They have other statements like a fool will be parted with his money very shortly. Did you ever hear that? They have all kinds of statements. But justice is a word made up by people, which really comes from religion. If somebody hurts you and they're killed in an accident, you see, that's justice in nature, taking care of the problem. But most people that are killed in accidents, people say it's terrible what happened to George. They don't say, well, that's the way he lived in the past, he's paying off for it. Or in India, they might say it's his karma. But all that's made by man. All laws, all right, wrong, good, bad, are made by man. In the early days, a king would have as many wives as he wanted. But that was not considered wrong. It was considered within the framework of that culture. So it seems to me that all man-made laws come from the elite, and the laws are to protect the elitists. Thou shalt not steal. The only people you can steal from was those that had more than you. And if everybody were wealthy, I would see, unless they've known scarcity in the past, they still might steal. They still might do corrupt things, like most bankers, lend money at interest. And that is considered lawful. Who made the law? The banks. So all the laws made by man are artificial. I see a society that could be designed where people are brought up to want to learn certain things that they're interested in. Of course, when I say they are interested in, society pushes. Society pushes things that would serve society as a whole rather than the individual. So I would say it would be wiser for people to learn things useful to everybody rather than just personal. There are people that sail boats that enjoy bucking the wind and moving fast, and they like the challenge. But that's a nothing challenge unless you instruct people in how to sail a boat. Just challenging, they say people need challenging things. Well, good health would be challenging. Good nutrition would be challenging, but if you can run faster than another person, it might make you feel good if you're brought up in that kind of a culture. But when I meet somebody that can run faster than me, I say, fine. I have no need to want to beat them. And if a person can play a musical instrument better than I can, good. I enjoy listening to it. But I don't have to say, gosh, I wish I could play it like that. People have ambitions that are totally senseless. Like some people want to win a beauty contest, or they want to solve problems in crossword puzzles. That's a sort of a nothing thing. And I would say winning a chess game has to do with strategy about nothing. If you play chess a great deal, and you practice a great deal, and read books on appropriate moves, you can become a better chess player. But being a good chess player is a nothing thing. I don't see what it does for. It doesn't make a man more inventive, only better at strategy in chess. And if you build the fastest airplane, and people have air races, and they want to win. They want to win because they have a low self-sufficiency. But I would see no reason to want to race an automobile if people can cut in front of you and cut your speed up. So it isn't really testing a car unless you ran the car around the track with one person at a time, and then that person that clocked faster would be more accurate than just a bunch of cars trying to cut in front of one another. I would say that it would be socially offensive in the future. But I would say that driving a car would be socially offensive. Wanting to win would be socially offensive. I think that that is based on earlier conditioning, receiving little approval. And once you win, everybody pats you on the back. But if you die, they say it's a shame. If you're in auto races and you hit the wall and the car bursts into flames and the driver dies, that's the price you pay for adventure. I don't consider that healthy adventure any more than a team in a boat rowing to beat another team in a boat. I don't think it proves anything. I don't think it might show that if you put a motor on, just put one person in a boat, you can beat them all. But nobody's interested in sanity. They're interested in beating another fellow. And that's what prize fights are about. If you can punch a guy enough, he may become punch drunk. Punch drunk is a form of insane behavior. I see nothing in that. I see nothing in a wrestling match. I see no reason to study self-defense if you're brought up in a sane society. Nobody's going to attack you, so you don't have to be a strategist. When he comes at you with his fist, you grab his fist and pull him over, take advantage of the motion he's in. But that would be an insane society. You make laws like that. All kinds of societies have different laws. If you're gay in one society, that's considered an unforgivable crime. In fact, it was considered that way in most countries that accept gay marriages now. So who makes the laws, and are there need for laws? I don't think so. If you create an abundance and you give people security, I don't think you need laws. I can't conceive of a need for laws of any kind except in technology. If a person builds an experimental aircraft, I would rather that he fly it over water rather than over cities, since it hasn't been tested yet. I would say things like that might exist in the future. But they're not arbitrary laws, they're designed to protect people. And if you want to build an experimental boat, you can't take a crew on it, but you might be able to operate it by radio control to see if it works. But if it flips over, the crew might drown. And boats, ocean liners or vacation liners, I should say, where people take a cruise for 3 months. The cruiser ship is built very high with a high center of gravity. It's to get as many people on as you can. Safety is not the prime factor. There's not enough lifeboats on most liners to take care of all the people. And it depends on the catastrophe. If the boat breaks in half due to the waves, there's no time to get on a lifeboat. You know what I mean? So I would say a lifeboat is in the monetary system where profit is the bottom line. I would say that our cruise ships are not sufficiently safe. I would say that aircraft that carries 150 passengers is the maximum that plane can carry. But if the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, decides how many passengers a plane can carry, if you put too much weight in the airplane, you can't take off. I remember when I was a kid, I even remember the name. The guy's name was Di Panito from Italy, who flew a Blanca aircraft. He was going to fly it across the ocean, but he filled it up with more gasoline than the plane can carry. That is, he put extra gas tanks in it. And at Floyd Bennett Field, Long Island, this is also many, many years ago, he tried to get off the ground. He kept bouncing and coming back to the ground. He was overloaded. And he hit the fence and it burst into flames, and Di Panito died. About 2 weeks later, a Japanese pilot was going to fly from Floyd Bennett Field to Japan, nonstop. Yasum Nagoya, that was his name. And he did the same thing with a Blanca. He loaded it with fuel, and he couldn't get off the ground. He kept up and down, hitting the ground, and he crashed into a wall. Because he wanted to secure his position with extra gas, but he didn't secure the flight characteristics of his airplane. So the security in one area did not provide security that would save his life. So when people talk about security, they think in terms of insurance, they think in terms of good brake job on the car. If you have the best brake job in the world, and she has a need for a brake job but can't afford it, if her brakes fail, you could die, even though you got good brakes. So I don't understand how you can develop security for all people when some people have differential advantage. I don't understand that. Now, if you can afford a better brake job, you might have a tendency to feel more secure. But if a poor man drives an old car that isn't sufficiently serviced, you can be killed, even though you got a belt, safety belt. And sometimes men that service aircraft, they're working on the airplane, there's a phone call for them at the airport, and they leave. And their wife was in an auto accident, so they go to the hospital, but they leave the job half done, and you don't know what's done and what isn't done. So no one would leave service in the future, and no one would answer phone calls, even though it's an emergency. You have to finish the job, finish the tab, finish the checklist, the landing gear, the wings, the fuel. If you finish the checklist, do you know what I mean? People can be called away today from a very, very important job. Or if an airplane pilot, I've read about this, I've never seen it, his wife left him and he was shattered. So he crashed the plane into the ground. He committed suicide with other passengers in there. Apparently he didn't concern himself with that. And when I was a kid, those of you that know what a Ford Tri-Motor is, they used to charge people by their weight at Newark Airport. If a person weighed 300 pounds, he paid more to get to travel by air because weight consumes fuel. But no, I thought that was a pretty ethical system at the time. But really, you just pay a certain amount, no matter what you weigh. So you're paying for fuel consumption of heavier people. And that might give a person a reason not to weigh as much. But I say all these laws, some of them are really ridiculous. But if you're brought up in a lawless society that's in scarcity, there's a great deal of trouble. When you live in scarcity, you have to make laws. Teach people not to steal, because you upset the culture when you steal. A man works harder than you steal his car and his hubcaps, and he says there's no sense in that. So he makes a law. Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you, or don't take anything from another person without their permission. So they make all kinds of definitions, and the definitions will disappear, all those definitions, when you surpass the economic system that requires such definition. Do you understand what I'm saying? So law is not necessarily a good thing. It's good for the established system, but an emergent system would try to deal with the problems that made the law necessary, to try to eliminate the conditions that make laws necessary. When you sit in a court of law and you sit in judgment of another person, knowing nothing about their background, but if you could see a movie of what shaped their values, you might feel somewhat ashamed to judge them. You say, gee, for the background that person had, he turned out pretty good. He only killed one person. You know what I mean? He could have killed 20 people, and some people are like that. So if you don't know the conditions that generate behavior, your judgment is immoral or amoral. You have no basis for making judgments. I don't know what it means in the Bible when it says, judge not, lest you be judged. I really don't know if the author of that statement knew what he was talking about. I don't think he meant what I'm talking about. So how do you prevent crime? Well, first of all, what is crime? Crime is a person really taking advantage of other people would be considered a crime. Using them or their labors for your own advantage only might be considered a crime. Therefore, all people that own factories are criminals. They exploit people, child labor, pay women less. So I don't know what crime means. I really don't. In wartime, when one soldier shoots 15 soldiers, he's not considered a criminal because that's considered just under those conditions. I'm sure the holy wars, the people were sincere. They killed people that weren't Christians because they were motivated by Satan. Ask any Christian. And so Christian behavior is criminal to the non-Christian. Where do you start? Where do you stop? Everybody wants to work within the laws that they know, and those laws are conditioned, and they're senseless. That's why I say we have to re-examine society. No one can re-examine society. Actually, they have to be taught a set of values that correspond to the nature of the world. But people can't think it over. They have nothing to think it over with. If they feel you did the wrong thing, Your concept of right and wrong is culture bound. Therefore, I said, use your head, think it over. That's not possible. Do you understand? So all laws are made for the advantage group. The disadvantage, I never make laws. They write music and they say if I had the governor or the governor had me, I'd let both the governor and the jailer go free. That's written by people in jail. Because people in jail, if somebody takes something from another prisoner, he gets mad at him. He beat him up and he say, look, we're all criminals here. That's normal to the environment. But if you were in jail and somebody removed your wristwatch at night when you were asleep, you say, that damn bastard, he stole my watch. Well, even in jail, they still have carryovers, even though they're there for robbery, breaking in, taking things that didn't belong to them. They still feel unjust has been committed. Do you understand that? They can't think of it any other way. And sometimes, if they spend a lot of time in jail, they say, I guess I'm just a common criminal. They even believe that. And if you believe that, you say, well, look, nobody respects me. They say, well, where were you the last 3 years? I was in jail. Why should a guy take a chance and hire him? You know, and why should he? So if he doesn't get hired, he says, I guess I'll go back to jail. I'll try one more break-in. Maybe I can get away with it. I'll get away with it. Maybe go to another country. Whatever it is he tries. Everybody tries to ease their condition. And a criminal is a person usually that's trying to ease their condition. Now, a person that makes laws that serve their interests. Is that fair? Not the interests of the poor. If there were poor people, they would like air conditioning, but they can't afford it. And in the winter, I remember during the Depression, my parents used to bang on the pipes. Did you ever experience that? They bang on the pipes because the landlord wouldn't turn up the heat because coal cost money during the Depression. And I remember another guy that owned an apartment house, and most of the people couldn't pay the rent, so he let them live there. But he did try to sell it, and during the Depression he couldn't sell it, so he was starving because he didn't collect much money. So he tried to get on relief. He said, you own an apartment house. He said, I can't sell it, and nobody can pay the rent. And he was right, but he couldn't get relief if you own an apartment house. Do you understand? So he says, he used to say, I starving. He was a foreigner. Say, I starving. I have an apartment house, but I have no money. And people had cars and they couldn't sell them during the Depression. Now there are economically advantaged people who bought things from people who were up to here in debt. And a pawn shop was great business during the Depression. And another great business was, I mentioned a pawn shop, people would bring their jewelry, their wares, but when a pawn shop can't even sell the stuff they got, they won't take in more stuff. When a bank repossesses cars, if they get 1,000 cars, they put them up at auction because they can't sell them in a depression. So a depression was a sad situation. Most people that lived in tin shacks in empty lots, they were about even. But if you found some corrugated aluminum, you made a better roof than a guy that used leaves. So there were advantaged, disadvantaged. Do you understand? He was somewhat technical. And there were many wealthy people that really believed that if you wanted a job, you could get it. Do anything. You don't have to be unemployed. You can go out there and get a job. But the pay was so little, you could hardly live. But they never thought, well, that's the way it is. You're a lazy damn reliever. You know, you live on relief and you want me to support you? Go get a job, any kind of job. And people did seek any kind of job. Some people did. They felt ashamed that they couldn't find a job. So in hitchhiking across the country, I used to knock at the door of a fairly established house. And I'd say, can I mow your lawn for a sandwich? But some kids used to break the window, sneak in, and take food out of the refrigerator. They didn't know that you can probably get more food that way by knocking at the door, say, can I mow your lawn, clean your windows, or do anything. I had better tools for getting through. A lot of kids were picked up for vagrancy. I don't know what it was exactly. I think you had to have $25 on your purse. And the policeman couldn't pick you up for vagrancy. Vagrancy was 30 days if you behave yourself. If you didn't behave well, you might get 60 days and a criminal record. And so when you got a criminal record, it was hard to get a job. And people picture, I guess I'm a common criminal. They had a low self-sufficiency, a low self-esteem, and in prison they say, what are you in for? You're worse than I am. You know what I mean? They had status even in prison. And the wealthy people that were in prison were in the drug business. When they were picked up, the government could not confiscate their bank account. They had an indirect deposit. And so people used to bring them things, wristwatch, TV set, whatever they wanted. So in jail, there was special privilege. They paid off some of the police wardens in jail. They paid them off to get special treatment. They get drugs or whatever they wanted. But if you had enough money, you can pay off people. If you had enough money, they had one case where a helicopter landed in the jail and took the top prisoners out. You ever hear that? Yeah, in jail. But a lot of the wardens and a lot of the guards were paid off, you understand, to permit that landing, because they'd be shot up if they didn't. And most judges in the early days were paid off. You got, if Al Capone or some other gangster, wealthy guys, I mean, worth millions, they pay off a judge, get a lot of witnesses that say that never happened, and the guy get off, if you can afford all those witnesses. So they had laminated protection. But a guy named Dewey, who was a lawyer, said if I'm elected, I would arrest the criminals. And he arrested them, top criminals. Now Dewey did it because he'd get elected that way. So he just ordered people to do that, arrest them, pick them up. Although it was illegal to do so unless you had a warrant for his arrest. And you couldn't do that. So the law can be bent by governors if it suits their purpose. Do you understand? So I found that all the laws, in fact, many judges were paid off during the Depression. They needed money. So there were judges that were honest, but the mafia got rid of them. You know what I mean? If there were judges that you couldn't pay off, you got rid of them. Arranged an automobile accident. They didn't always shoot the guy they didn't like. They arranged accidents. It was an accident. And if some stool pigeon in your group would confess that it wasn't an accident, it was pre-planned. Before the trial came up in court, they had him knocked off, a witness. Do you understand? So he could not witness against people. So the court would say, damn it, we lost our best witness. That's to be expected in the money system. So when you use the word justice, I don't know what a person is talking about. Justice for whom? And why do you need justice? Why do people need justice? If a man rapes your daughter, he's deprived of sex. You should provide sex for him. In Mexico, they do allow wives to come to prison and satisfy their husbands. But if you don't do that, you're going to have aberrated sexual behavior, especially if a young boy is put in prison. If he doesn't conform, they fix his wagon. So the laws that prisoners make are different than the laws that non-prisoners make. Prisoners, if they don't make laws, they're hidden laws. They're not on paper. But they know what the law is. When you go into prison, if you don't submit, they make it very tough on you. Do you understand? So either you obey that unwritten law, and that's what we have today. I see no basis for any social system today that has laws. It means that there's scarcity, there's need, there's wants that are not met. There are needs that are not met, and that's what the law is. The law is an attempt to pick up those people who violate the laws made by those who can afford to make laws. Now, I would say that if a doctor gets a job in a prison and he has no compassion, he treats the sick prisoners not like he would treat paying people outside the prison. So there are many prison doctors that really don't care. There are many prison psychiatrists think they're dealing with criminals. They want to understand the criminal mind. And the criminal mind is forced by scarcity. And that would be a criminal offense. Being a psychiatrist examining the criminal mind, to me, the man would be a criminal doing that compared to some future society. So I have no compassion at all for this system. I see soldiers as killing machines because unless they say, I will not kill anybody, then they'll be discharged. To be given dishonorable discharge in the Army. But a dishonorable discharge, to me, is better than killing people. To me, according to my laws. Well, who the hell am I? When the whole of society makes laws that's good for people, they do not respect individual laws. They cannot respect it and maintain their society. If they don't put people in prison, they have to hire more policemen. And just recently, some state, I forgot which state it was, has cut their police force in half. And sometimes a man that can't get a job, so I'll try to commit robbery, and if I'm caught, at least I'll be fed and given medical care, even though it's limited. It's better than nothing. It's better than being a street person, sleeping over a grating where heat comes up in the winter. I've seen that. And I've seen hobo camps where the hobos were very fine people, very good-natured, share what little they had, and they had nothing to share. And I remember older people sleeping on top of a freight train, and when a train went through a tunnel, sometimes they were injured, and they died, and the hobos buried them, falling off the trains too. And, you know, it was just, to me, it was just a horror movie, the Great Depression, because I have seen so many things I never had a chance to really talk about, but I may have told you I was hitchhiking with a boy my age, around 17 in the old days, and the guy drove up in a car and said, "Would you like to make a buck?" And this kid who was with me, he said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to give my girlfriend a note. Tell her that I can't see her this weekend." That's what the note. So he gave the guy 50 cents and 50 cents when he brought back the receipt from the girlfriend. Well, the girlfriend was a cashier at the movie theater, and the note said, "If you don't give the kid all the money you've got, I got a gun aimed at your head." So she screamed, and the police came and took the kid away. The kid had no idea why he was arrested, but he had a criminal record now. Do you understand? That's why the word justice has no meaning to me. I was riding a freight train, and everybody was jumping off the freight train. I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Railroad dicks up ahead." Railroad dicks are people that take people that riding a freight train, which is illegal, put them in jail. So I stayed on the train anyway. I stayed on, the only one. Everybody else jumped off. And the railroad dick hit me with a flashlight, shining. "What are you doing on the train?" "I'm trying to get to Key West. I have no job, and I may get a job in Key West." He said, "All right, lay low." Now that's rare, but, you know, I don't know what would have happened to me. And sometimes at a chain gang, they lease out 10 members of the chain gang to a certain farm for $30, and they work them free on the farm. To me, that's captive slavery. You understand? That used to happen a lot during the Depression. So if you understand, the Depression itself generates the condition that people make laws. So when you say, well, where do the laws come from? That's where they come from. They're laws made to protect the in-group. They're never made to protect the out-group or the minorities. When a black man says, "I've been beaten up by 3 white men," the police officer doesn't even make a record of it, most of them. They don't seek it out either. So there's no justice for many of the minorities during a depression. So I've seen so much of that condition. That's where I got the ideas that there's no such thing as justice. If I hadn't lived at that time, I would have been normal. Normal means loused up, aberrated. But the Depression changed a lot of the values I was given, which I thought made sense. And to me, they made sense because I've known no other values until I was hitchhiking across the country. I learned a great deal, but what I learned didn't do me any good. Can you understand? I was never put in jail. I always voluntarily went to a police or prison and said, "I'd like to sleep overnight. I have no place to sleep." They said, "We have to fingerprint you and photograph you to make sure you're not wanted or anything." I said, "Sure." But I didn't want to sleep out in the cold. And since I did that, they had a slightly different attitude. But the jail was terrible. It was a filthy toilet bowl with fecal matter all around, and the bed sheets were dirty and stained. There was a little red light. Terrible. And it smelled in there. So I just sat in the corner of the cell. It was better than sleeping outside. But anyway, there were prisoners that were there for 4 or 5 years. And since they had to behave themselves, if they wanted to get out in 4 or 5 years, they were called trustees. And they were prisoners that went around with a flashlight checking the other prisoners. And they were still called stool pigeons by the other prisoners. Stoolies. The goddamn stoolie. And they tried to kill them. because they worked with the police. They snitched on everybody else. So they broke the code of the majority of prisoners. Stoolies didn't live too long in big prison. So there were very few stoolies, but all they needed was one to tell the police what's going on. There's a prison break planned for this Sunday. This is a stoolie. So police were prepared for it, with tear gas and all that. But they got that stoolie. They broke his neck or they cut his throat or whatever weapons they had. You understand? The prisoners had to develop a set of ethics that served their needs. Do you understand that? There was never a prison that I read about where no code of ethics existed. There's always a code of ethics. And there's always laws in prison, although they're silent. They're not written in a diary or paper. It's an unwritten law. It comes about of necessity. So, do you respect the law? I have no use for it. Will I violate the law? No, because the price is too high. I cannot live according to the law because it doesn't make sense. No law ever made sense to me. Human behavior never made much sense. So I didn't even know when I was a kid, I didn't know whether people were alive or not because they lived in accordance with the law. They lived in accordance with the values of their culture, and that isn't Billy James. That's somebody else that they grabbed when he was young and taught him the law, and they taught him a profession. That isn't you. If you're an American, that isn't you. If you're a German, that isn't you if you're a Swede, a professional Swede. You know what I mean? You're what they want in Sweden. So when a person says, is there a place for individuality? Yes, it's called prison. Being ostracized, that's a place for you. So nobody is really free. They're victims of culture. I am a victim of culture, but I've come to a set of patterns of behavior which will enable me to survive in an admired society. I think most people do that to some extent, but they still feel that society knows best, that the laws are made to protect people. And there's nothing I can say about that, but I'm putting this out so that you might understand something of what I'm talking about. The society you live in cannot be just. It cannot be fair. It can only carry out the standards of the society you live in, which are determined to a large extent by scarcity. And that is the real meaning and the mechanism that shapes human behavior. A person says, no, they're only decency. Laws are made to uphold common decency. There's no such thing as common decency. All those are man-made. All concepts of decency are man-made. Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you from me without my permission. And when you go to work for a company, they don't ask you what you want to do. They order you to do certain things. So it seemed to me, every corporation I went to work for, whenever I punched that time clock, I entered a dictatorship, which they dictated what I do for 8 hours a day. I fill perfume bottles, or I stuff dolls, or I grind seams off dolls' legs. That's a dictatorship. Even when I left the parking lot, it said no left turn. So I didn't know what freedom meant when I went to work for that company. Because I never worked for a company that said do what you like to do, pick whatever you want to pick, and how much do you want a week? What would meet your needs? They never asked me that. They said you get $10 a week or $3 a week. It was all a dictatorship to me. But the normal people, normal means those people that were brought up as victims of culture, accepted that. They said, well, at least I got a job. To me, it was a dictatorship, but they never asked me, how many days a week would you like to work? What would you feel would be adequate for you as a decent, free American? No company ever talked that way to me. As they say, look, Jock, you've got poor health. Why don't you take a week off? We'll give you pay anyway, because you're still a good person in our factory. Well, very few industrialists were like that, because there was always a list of people they had wanting your job, and they pick up the phone the minute you got sick and tell the next guy to come in. It's easier than paying you. But if it was a small company like a law firm, sometimes they did give you 3 days off or a week off if you brought in a lot of money, if you were important. But no company I ever worked for asked me what I'd like to do. When a person bought a married couple a home and a car, they gave them a damn good start. If you have wealthy folks and they can send you to college, which increases your earning capacity, you might even want to uphold the law. A lawyer feels that he's upholding the law, some of them. And very few lawyers, except guys like Clarence Darrow, were lawyers that worked against themselves and their profession. Very few people write books on the insufficiencies of society because the book would not sell. Do you understand that? Why I'm a businessman and how I got through the Depression. That's what they want to know. Businessmen want to know, how can I survive hard times? They don't want a book out saying what's the matter with a businessman. They don't want those books. And if a publisher publishes your book, and if it doesn't sell, he gets the brunt. But if you how to be successful in hard times, that book will sell. And the professions that were successful during the Depression, or a sign business, selling out, going out of business. Those sign painters made money until people pre-printed those signs. And you can go and buy a sign in any hardware store, house for sale. Nobody had to paint it anymore. And I told you another business that was successful. This guy wore a strap around his neck with a big coffee pot. And he walked down the street, and for 15 cents, he gave you a cup of coffee, a sandwich, one cigarette, and a piece of chocolate. That was a successful business until a lot of people bought the coffee pot. They were wiped out. Whenever you do anything successful, when the ballpoint pen came out, it's a rolling pen. It was better than dipping into ink. And it sold for $10 to $15. And they sold a lot of those pens. So one company infringed on the patent. And the guy tried to sue him. While he was suing them, 10 other companies infringed. So he let go. Then 50 companies. You can't fight that sort. Don't have the money to fight them. So there are many patent infringements and lawsuits continuously. China does a lot of that. It picks up ideas and doesn't pay for them. It doesn't have to. Why should they? You could maintain the competitive edge if you fringe on other patents. Do you understand? Okay. So don't keep asking me, is there ethical laws in the Venus Project? There are no laws in the Venus Project because it doesn't have to be laws. People do what they've been trained to do to help everybody advance, including themselves. The longer society exists, the sane, the higher the standard of living. You don't need laws, you don't need presidents, you don't need Congress, and you don't need a governor, and you don't need police if your society is saner. The transition, I always said, will be painful, because you're moving from one system to another system. And there'll be those that have been so indoctrinated by the old system, they will give you a hard time. So the transition will not be easy, because I don't see people saying, sure, let's help one another. I can't see everybody doing that, because they say, what's the bottom line in that society? What's the catch? You know what I mean? Are you trying to enslave us? Work for nothing? What do you get out of it? You know, people are very suspicious of anything that promises a saner world. In fact, the more you promise, the more suspicion there'll be against you by people who've been brought up to suspect people that promise good things. If it sounds too good to be true, reject it. They've got all kinds of statements prefabricated, ready-made. That's why all transitions met with a great many problems. Ethics and the future. Seeking law and justice. The seeking of law and justice. Yeah. I'm just saying that the way the setup is, it leads certain people of disadvantage, such as education, not having had enough education, or not being able to read or write. They get disadvantaged jobs. Even if a black man graduated from high school, they had him clean the toilet. Do you understand what I mean? They did not give him a job right away. In the old days, they gave their priority people, like themselves, the whites, the best first choice. Now, I remember in a court of law in the South, I remember a man getting up saying, if the black man was treated unjustly, and he explained that in a court of law, the white man would say, are you going to take a nigger's word for a white man's word? in a court of law in the South, and the black man had no chance, even though he told the truth. Telling the truth didn't get you anywhere. So the law was not necessarily rigid and protected people, although there were few judges that were ethical, but very few. They had their notions. And whenever they saw a Mexican, they looked at him with suspicion. When they saw a black man, they looked at him with suspicion. When they saw a peasant from another country with a thick dialect, they looked upon him with suspicion, because most underprivileged people were not as ethical as privileged people, meaning they didn't carry out the law entirely. If they spoke with a dialect, they were looked upon with suspicion. They were foreigners, and damn foreigners wanted to take over this country and bring their foreign ideologies here. We don't want any foreign ideas. We got our own ideas. This is the way they talk. So I would say the Depression really exposed to a large extent the rigidity of our culture, the artificiality of our culture. My father used to carry plants on a wagon, and this guy drove up and he said, "Mr. Fresco, you need protection." And he said, "What's that?" "I want $10 a week from you, and we'll protect you." He said, "Oh, I don't need protection. Everybody likes my work." So they wrecked his wagon and broke his plants and everything else. You understand? So these guys used to go to all stores and say, "I want $5 a week from you." Guy says, "I hardly earn $7 a week." So either you pay it or we'll throw acid on your clothing. If you had a tailor shop or something like that, there were gangs on every block that went around and got their pay from a fruit stand. They said, "We'll break the legs of the fruit stand. Your fruit is going all over. We'll have guys wreck your place, or you pay us $3 a week." The smaller the gang, the newer the gang, the lower the price. But when one gang moved in on another gang's territory, then there was gang wars. If you broke things because they didn't pay you $3 a week, and I charged $10 a week, the gang wars. You understand? Gang wars are not just gang wars. One gang did the same job you did for less, and they were in your territory. So you say, "I don't care where you work, don't work in my territory." Okay? So gang wars were legitimate. They had their own laws. They beat up people who didn't obey their laws. I don't know if it's too heavy or too direct. And the guy said he's rationalizing crime, I know people would say that. He's really justifying crime.
And they missed the whole point of the lecture.
Yes, they would. But I can't afford the sunny day in May before the lecture. I'll just tell them what happened. And there are some people that commit crimes every day and never get caught. They're called a perfect crime. It's a mechanic telling a woman how much it costs to fix a car, which he knows. Very few women know enough about mechanics. There are people that are foolproof, like banks. They can charge you a certain amount of interest, which may be heavy for you. And you wind up owing twice as much as you paid for the house. If you buy a house with a 30-year loan, they lap on all kinds of costs, which to me is criminal. The reason that religious people fight one another is because if they can convert everybody to a Lutheran, it's easier to manage. And so when a Lutheran moves into a Catholic neighborhood, they become a threat to certain standards.
What about an atheist?
An atheist is a threat to all standards. So atheist couldn't be hired because he's apt to be immoral, they figure, because he doesn't believe in the law. And religion is loaded with the law to protect the wealthy. That's where Hammurabi Code was invented a long time ago. It was invented so long ago that if you designed a building and it caved in, the architect had to pay with his life. And if 2 children died, they killed 2 of his children. So the architect became very well aware of structure and how thick a beam ought to be. You know what I mean? Because the codes in the old days, when they designed bridges and a family drowned, the bridge broke, they then made standards before you designed a bridge. That's where the standards came from. That's where tests came from. Because things didn't work, it killed people. It's so much easier for psychiatrists to say, the guy is just justifying aberrant behavior. Man is evil. It's so much easier to understand. It really is much easier to understand the law and to re-examine the law. I'm not asking people to do criminal things. I'm just saying that's the way it is.
Okay, so that's Justice and Law by Jacques. As I said, unfortunately, they're not available today to answer your questions. So myself, Sean, and anyone else who feels that they answer their questions can have a go. We'll get started on those now. Do you want to start with the first one, Sean?
The person you are trying to talk with gets very loud and emotional. Do you just stop and try again later? Remaining calm seems to lead them to get more upset. All right, so this is just a question about like how do you approach people in different manners, and then this one is specifically about what happens when they get emotional.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So what do you do when a person's talking and gets very loud and emotional? Do you stop and try again later? Basically, you've got to understand that when someone's getting emotional, it's because you're talking about something that's outside of their values or outside of their what they consider to be right and just or whatever. So yeah, I mean, you've got to try and approach people from an angle that they don't feel threatened by. So, for example, a good example Jack gives when talking to someone about religion and how science is more relevant to the world that we live in. You can't just attack someone on religion and say, well, religion's, you just believe in some guy in the sky who, looks down and judges on people and answers your prayers and stuff like this, and it's not relevant to the world we're living in. They can't understand that. They'll see that as an attack. So you need to come at them from a different angle and try and approach them from a side where values that they hold true within their religion are parallel with the values that we hold within the Venus Project. So it's really a case of trying to understand where that person's coming from, why they're getting upset, what it is that you're saying, what part of what it is that you're saying is causing a rise in that person, and then trying to find a different way around getting to the person on that level.
Also, something that Jacques would say would essentially, you're speaking to their values, but also don't spend so much time on them. Give them a tool or two if you can, and there's many possible tools. We can go over that later, but give them the tool and send them on their way. And hopefully down the line, they will utilize that tool and begin to utilize other tools, which will then allow them to understand and comprehend these concepts.
One of the places you see this in sort of everyday play is on Facebook, for example, where you see people going into these huge long debates lasting days or even weeks with the same person and just hitting a brick wall with it. And whilst you might feel that this is good for your communication skills and how you explain the Venus Project and the values that we're sort of promoting, your time would be so much better spent on sort of, instead of just on one person, spending a week on that person, to spend one day on one person. You do seven people in a week that are actually inquisitive towards this direction or at least sort of on their way to this direction. So it's really, you sort of have to weigh up the pros and cons of how much time you're spending on a specific person and whether that's really worth it in the long run. Okay, so next question. What about animal rights? What will be made in the Venus Project in that way? Animal rights in the current system. Animals really don't have very many rights. When you actually look at the causation of what causes things like animal cruelty. Animal cruelty is caused by what we would class as aberrant values of that person. So someone kicking a dog or drowning a cat, something like that, we would consider that to be an aberrant behaviour. The problem is that no matter how many laws that you implement for the protection of animals, none of those laws actually stop the animal being hurt in the first place. What they do is they actually punish the person for the act after the act's been done. So in the Venus Project, the idea is to get people's values to a much more saner state than what we have now. Once people start to change their values to a more egalitarian, to a more caring set of values, both towards other human beings and towards animals and the environment itself, we believe that you'll see a lot less damage done by those people with the aberrant behaviours because there'll be lots less of them. So, for example, I would say, an aberrant behaviour in this system might be the chopping down of rainforests. That's something that would stop or would be greatly minimised by a change in the values of the people that don't understand the damage that we're doing in the ecology. So you've got the same situation with animals, that if you change the values of people so that the values are no longer aberrated in that sense, you won't have to make the laws to implement to look after the state and welfare of animals.
I don't have much to say on this, but I do remember a Jacques response being somewhere along the lines of, when people usually ask this question, it's based on current issues with animal rights, and that is animal cruelty or using them as test subjects. And Jacques said basically, provide an alternative when we need to test a chemical or whatever that a human might be exposed to. We might actually, sometimes use animals. If you can provide an alternative, then that would be a good focus to put your work towards.
What is the status of the big movie project? Is there a web page that shows full transparency of what is going on? Last I heard, there was $110k US donated, of which $100k US dollars would be spent on a scriptwriter. Any further information that we are missing? Okay, so the current status is as what's on the website, on the main TVP website. The initial $100,000 was to be raised so that we could hire a scriptwriter to start laying out the script and to actually develop a full script that we could then take to production houses or to different studios, etc., to promote the idea of the film and to try and get funding for it. As you probably know, to get a big blockbuster movie done, normally it's the studio itself that will take on the full costs of developing the film, or the director themselves. Obviously, we don't have millions to spend on a movie, so that's probably the route that we'll have to go down. And to do that, you need a script, which has got to be written by a proper professional scriptwriter. It's not something that just anyone can do. So at the moment, there's obviously a 10,000 excess, or I think it's 30,000 excess or something on there at the moment. Any money that's being put into Future by Design, which is the non-profit, is basically held in a trust, if you like, or in a non-profit's bank account, and will be used towards the movie itself. So if we can start developing up things like trailers or shorts to show studios what that would what the movie might be like, etc., that's what that kind of funding would go towards. So promotional terms and things to get this going. So that's basically it, really.
Right, they're still at the stage of finding a proper scriptwriter, correct?
Yes, I think they've been working with several scriptwriters to try and see if any of them are suitable. Obviously, not every writer is going to understand these ideas fully, just as not every person that you meet or talk to understands them fully. They need to make sure that they're happy with the person's understanding of the Venus Project, of the resource-based economy, and the tenets that we talk about. The person also needs to have a good vision and a good communication with Jacques as to sort of bringing his vision to life. They're trying out different scriptwriters at the moment to see if they can find the right one. So the money hasn't been spent in the sense of they haven't actually selected a definite scriptwriter at this stage.
What is your opinion on the idea of a one world government, and can it prepare the grounds for transition to the global resource-based economy?
So I can't obviously answer for Jacques on this one. I would say that the problem that you've got with one world government in this system is that it's bad enough with separate governments being corrupt. To think of them all getting together to be one massive corrupt government is just, don't think it's going to get us anywhere. You've only got to look at things like the United Nations. It's corrupt on so many levels, it's not even funny. I personally can't see politics being any solution to any of the problems that we've got. I can't see it personally being a transition towards a global resource-based economy, but then I could be wrong.
Will we start raising cows and pigs to use as food, or will we create alternatives so we don't need to enslave animals anymore? I've definitely heard discussions about using alternatives and actually creating proteins such as meats and to help us sustain ourselves if we so need it. but most of the focus is on the vertical agriculture and therefore a stronger vegetarian diet.
Something to add to that, really. Basically, to think that we're going to have massive changes in the way all human beings on this planet are going to eat or behave instantly, it's not realistic. What's going to happen is we're going to have a gradual transition, people's values, of people's behaviours, of the system itself into what we call a resource-based economy. So, in the short term, I can't see really all of the world's just suddenly going to stop eating meat, and that we're not going to continue with pig farming, and that we're not going to continue with cow farming and all the rest of it. In the long term, obviously, as far as animal rights are concerned, it's certainly not the perfect ideal solution to carry on killing animals for consumption. There are technologies at the moment in development, such as research going into developing lab-grown meats, which you can find on the tvpmagazine.com website. There's an article there called Lab-Grown Meat to be Served Up by Chef Heston. This is something that's in its very, very early stages, but can definitely see within the next few years to the next decade or so that lab-grown meats could be a complete replacement for our current practices of killing animals for food. So I think in the long term, it's not something that will be continued.
Right. Without monetary incentive, it would be less likely that there would be factory farming of cows and chickens and pigs, which is really where a lot of the outrage comes from, because those conditions are just horrible. So just removing that incentive alone would likely lead to just regular farming, where it'd be free range. And that's a much more quote unquote humane style of raising cattle. And
Okay, next one. Americans value freedom, privacy, and individuality. What would be the best way to promote TVP to Americans?
the same thing as before, it's appealing to that value system, but also not using too much of your time. In my opinion, America will likely be one of the slowest countries to come around to this type of mindset, but it's still a possibility.
Absolutely, and if you take those three things, freedom, privacy, and individuality, all of those things we advocate in the Venus Project if you look at it from the right angle. So, freedom to do what? Freedom to kill people? No. Freedom to enjoy your life, freedom to have access to a home, have freedom to travel the world, all of these things that we do advocate. So there's a lot of freedoms that we do talk about in the Venus Project, and they're all beneficial. Freedoms that aren't beneficial obviously wouldn't be acceptable, and is something that we would try to drive out with our value system rather than through laws. Something to bear in mind is that during the transition we would still require laws. People's values are still aberrated in most of the world. Even once you start getting some cities up and running, and you've got people living in those cities that have got a different set of values to what's currently sort of globally accepted, you're still going to get a certain level of that aberrancy showing through even in those people until they've been in their environment long enough for those values to be fully substantiated and for those behaviours to really set in. So it's a long-term thing. So things like privacy and individuality, again, the more you give people access to the things they need, the more education you give people access to, the more individual they become, the more things that they become interested in. So all those sort of things you can approach Americans with, just coming at a slightly different angle to what they're used to.
Right, and a statement like "you're only as free as your purchasing power" would appeal to this type of culture. And then also what Roxanne says along the lines of a standard of living in the future and something like a resource-based economy would be better, or you would be more free and have more access than the richest person on earth today. So I think these would be really good statements to be using on this type of demographic. All right, next one. I know you talked about how all behavior is learned from the environment, and the environment is something you don't always have control over. How do you define when somebody is responsible for their actions?
Well, that's a semantic piece of work, that one is, isn't it? Right, okay, responsible for their actions. again, this really comes down to the environment that you live in and the values that you hold. Is someone that steals food because they're hungry responsible for their theft? No, not at all. They've got no control over the fact that they can't have access to food, and that the only way they could get access to food would be to steal. So I think the whole idea of responsibility has to be really looked at as to what does that word even mean. Is a killer responsible for what they do? Not at all. You have to look at the background of what caused that person to become the way they were. What was it in their environment that drove them that way? I think we need to sort of move away from being responsible and towards working out what it is we need to change within the environment and how we need to support people within the environment to change those behaviours so that you don't have to deal with that responsible ethos of whether someone has done something that they shouldn't have done.
Yes, can I add something to that, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of responsibility, you're responsible to what? You're responsible to authority, you're responsible to law. And what Andrew said, we have to focus first on education and understanding of behavior of the person, and make person to understand what drives his behavior to do that. And if it's their environment, it doesn't matter. In a sense, I feel nobody responsible for their behavior as long as they don't understand. Period. But it helps if a person try to understand what drives his or her behavior at first.
Just saw in the chat there from Sarah, it's fine to change the cultural triggers for that behaviour, but what about dealing with that person right now? Something myself and Jack discussed in a couple of weeks ago. A similar kind of question came up. And basically what we were saying was that to understand that we're in a transitionary period, you cannot go from the state we're at now with laws, police, prisons, etc., to a state of no law, no prisons and no police. It would be absolute chaos with the value systems that are in place. It would be absolute chaos with the behaviours that are currently in place. And this goes from all levels, from the high level corruption of politicians and bankers and businessmen, right the way down to petty thefts or the in-betweens of murderers, etc., etc. So during the transition, we would still need to have incarceration of people that are considered to be socially problematic, people that kill, people that rape, people that molest children, people that suicide bombers, things like this. All these people would have to be incarcerated to protect the people in the society during the transition. But we feel that as you educate people, and it's going to be a generation thing, as you educate each generation, the level of aberrancy, the level of aberrant behaviours, the level of problems that you see in the environment that you've got will become less and less over time, for each generation as they grow up in the new system. So eventually the idea is that you get to a stage where those behaviours are no longer part of your social or cultural makeup, whereas at the moment almost every human being brought into this current system is going to be aberrated to a certain degree depending on their particular environment. Did that answer your question, Sarah?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, next one.
How do you see a transition from a law society where people need an authority to satisfy their need for justice to a society where the law, I believe it's supposed to be law, the law will be common sense and a similarity with natural law?
We pretty much just covered that one with the whole education and the generational education. So I think that's pretty much covered.
Yeah, I think so. I could just answer the one word. That would be the education, and then just time. Unfortunately, it will take some time for people to adjust. Some estimate a few generations for us to adjust completely out of some of these aberrancies.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the values of people, let's say 400 or 500 years ago, thankfully, through generations of people dying off, those values tend to will get lost over time. So We don't go around burning our neighbours on stakes anymore. Thankfully, those people died out and their young came up and were brought up in a slightly different environment that was slightly more sane than what it was previously, although that's debatable. And there is a natural progression over time that the old values die off with the people that die off. So I think you'll see a similar kind of thing during the transition towards a resource-based economy, that some of the older folks with their really screwed up values, as they die off, the newer generations come through with a different education, different environment, different understanding of the world they live in. You'll get a different set of values.
May I just add something there, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Just to say that I think also once we get rid of things such as publicity and marketing and all these things that twist the perception of who we are and what we need, I think this will speed up a great deal the process. Once we've got rid of those negative influences, I think it will help greatly in the improvement of how we behave and so on.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. Cheers.
Does Jacques think a competent democracy could be a positive step forward towards an RBE? And I wish I had a recording of him just saying, no.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Yeah, no, that's no more needs to be said. Is the need for an identity a necessity for man?
It might be something that has to do with individuality. I cannot answer this question very well, but I could say that something like me needing to be me and needing to have this and that, I could argue that that was a learned behavior.
Yeah, I'm assuming, and this is just an assumption from this, is the need for an identity a necessity for man? I'm wondering whether this applies to the kind of social identity, i.e., I'm a policeman, I'm a doctor, I'm an engineer, or whatever. No, I don't think that's something that's innate and required by human beings. I think it's something that's generated within an environment or within a culture. You tend, if you look at sort of tribal life in Africa, or like when Jack visited the South Pacific, you don't get that social identity of I'm a specific type of person within my society. So it's definitely very cultural in its background.
Yeah, and we don't born with identity. This is learned, completely learned, because the example of it can be kids who was left in the forest or abducted by apes or live with the wolves. We have, or even with dogs. We have these examples. A recent example in Ukraine, a little girl was abandoned with parents, and she was raised by a dog. And almost 8 or 7 years, she was completely behaving as a dog, and she get through very painful process to adapt to human values, and she's way behind of her peers in development. But if the identity, what we mean by identity in this culture, and what the parents told us, what the authorities told us, where you're a boy or a girl, you belong to this group or belong to that group. In my point of view, maybe in the future we can identify yourself with different values with the projects we do for advance of humanity in general.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. I've just put a link actually in the chat there to Oksana Malaya. That's the young girl that you were talking about, I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
Roxanne mentioned in a lecture that you listen to tapes in the car and never stop learning. What are you listening to at the moment? Obviously, we can't answer this because they're not here, but make sure to add this back to next week. But essentially, their daily routine is to wake up, begin working. Jacques still reads. He watches news. He reads books constantly. He's constantly still thinking and drawing. Roxanne wakes up and answers emails, answers phone, works on the movie. He's doing that day and night. So it's nothing but learn or work. That's kind of the whole point with what she was covering with that. But you could ask her specifically next week, maybe. I've read that Jack loves his bran muffins. Please can you tell us the recipe. So the same thing next to that one. Or just email them. meadows@thevenusproject.com. All right, I haven't found a proper answer to this question. Can you help me, please? How do we determine in the Venus Project what percentage of our resources will be allocated towards making musical instruments, for example, instead of researching cures for illness? We have to do the first steps first, and the first steps is to accurately measure what we have, and then accurately, I don't know if the word distribute is correct for it, but take care of the base needs of everybody on Earth. And that's food, housing, shelter, safety, education, and air. After that, obviously, the intent is for there to be leftover resources, and that will then be used for these extras.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the distribution of resources will be based on a priority system that will be based on the values that we advocate within the Venus Project. So like Sean said, it would be based on covering for the needs of people first and then for the wants of people. It's an aberrancy of your values if you feel that resources should be spent on your own private ship that you want built rather than those resources that are needed to be used for a hospital to heal the sick. So it really comes down to what values do we agree on? Do we agree on the fact that people need, their basic needs met? And if so, that's the priority for where our resources get spent. It really is as simple as that.
What is a good way to communicate to a sports fan that watching and supporting competitive sports is a waste of time and detrimental to them?
You have to let them know that something exists outside of TV.
Well, the thing is, you're not going to be able to reason with them. You can't say to someone who enjoys football that it's a nothing thing. I know Jack does, but you can't say to them it's a nothing thing. You won't need it in the future. Blah, blah, blah. People cannot accept that. That's not where they're coming from. They've either been brought up with football or they've been brought up in competitive sports, whatever they are, etc. And that's within their values. That's something that they feel is important to their value set. So again, you've got to sort of wean people off this and replace it with something. It's like trying to take away religion from someone and not replacing, not giving them anything back to replace it with. It just doesn't work. So we can't get rid of these faults. You can't just say, well, that's it. We're going to ban them in the future, and therefore you can't do them. You'll just create animosity and hatred towards the people doing that. What you can do is start to implement systems, games, etc., from an early age that teach cooperation and the benefits of cooperation over competition. It's only through time and education that people will start to see the benefits of cooperating far outweigh any competition-based ideas or based sports or based, work or anything else. I think that pretty much covers it.
Generally, if you're speaking about things that are seemingly attacking of somebody's value system, a one-on-one situation, you're going to get a direct response and this person is going to feel it directly. But if you must cover these subjects, it's better to do it in groups or lectures of much larger groups. And the individuals that might perceive this as an attack to them will kind of spread this attack out amongst the crowd and not take direct offense. So you can, in a sense, you can get away with saying something like sports are irrelevant or covering the aspects of why that is better in speaking to a large crowd that you might be. Then the results will be better in a large crowd than it would be on a one-to-one individual basis.
Unless they're all from the same team.
Next one, what help does Jacques need to come to UN Rio 20 conference, the future we want, to present the Venus Project vision and solutions to the world through UN tools and channels? I don't have any specific information on this, but generally when and if you want them to come, you need to first have communications with them directly and then begin to administrate and manage how this goes about. And that means contacting whatever the venue is, making sure the proper people are managing things, and then actually they do need funding to come to places. For plane tickets, they have to fly a special class for Jacques to have his feet up. So anyway, it's a lot of direct communication with Roxanne if you're going to be attempting to manage them coming somewhere.
I'd just like to add to that actually, something we quite often get is that people would love Jack and Roxanne to go over there and to their countries and do lectures, etc., which is, it's great. We really look forward to doing stuff like that, but at cost only. So in other words, we'll cover your hotel and your flight, but that's it. Unfortunately, we do live in a monetary system. I can't afford to go somewhere and just have my flights and hotel covers cost. I've still got to pay bills back in the UK no matter where I am. Also, I'd have to take time off work and thus lose my wages. So similar thing with Jack and Roxanne, that they'd need to be paid a fee on top of covering the expenses for whatever event it is that you're wanting them to do. So just bear that in mind before sort of contacting them about it.
I believe I've heard Roxanne actually say he can fly business class, but as time goes by, he just turned 96. I think the overall schema of him flying becomes less likely. So anyway, short answer to that question is to contact Roxanne directly if you have a strong plan and you're willing to put a lot of work into getting that arranged. Why are crosswords a nothing thing? I enjoy them and consider they improve my mental agility and vocabulary. Yeah, sure. It's not a competition. It's something to improve the person that does them.
Will there be ideas like entertainment in the future of TVP if everyone is satisfied with work and there is no need for leisure time because of self-fulfillment being realised during work? Would people ever look to sports or video games for downtime? And would the lack of need wipe out the industry entirely? Or would the lack of need wipe out the industry entirely? I think the type of entertainment will be very different in the future. When you think of entertainment in this system, generally it's either going out and getting drunk or being indoors, playing games or watching television, etc. And the problem is that most of those things include aberrant values or the teaching of aberrant values within their programming, hence why they're called programming. I think entertainment will be very different in the Venus Project in the sense of any soaps, etc. on television would be aimed at reinforcing the positive values that you'd want to see in such a culture. So rather than seeing, things like Hollyoaks where people are either constantly fighting, shouting at each other, killing each other, etc., etc., I think the programs would be very, very different in a resource-based economy. As far as things like entertainment, as in outside entertainment, I think the avenues for having more entertainment would be much increased to what they are now. Bear in mind, you'd have the ability to travel anywhere in the world at any time without any restriction. You'd have access to any resources that you needed for leisure time. So things, for example, if you liked, scuba diving, you wouldn't have to pay to go on holiday and spend a week scuba diving or whatever and pay for all the gear and pay for the actual dives, etc. All of those things would be freely available to you. So I think the level of entertainment will be raised many times to what it is at the moment as far as your enjoyability of it. Okay, so just wanted to do a quick announcement actually while I've got a lot of you here in the room. I've made a couple of announcements on the various Skype groups. I'm not sure if all of you are in those or not. Basically, over the past couple of 2 to 3 weeks, I've been working with Andras Biro on a new email system that will basically make my life a lot easier in the sense of building up an actual administration team for the emails coming into the Venus Project, for general inquiries and team inquiries, etc. We are looking at building up 4 administration teams that consisting of, you'll have the global administration team, which currently is just me and Sven. You'll have the TVP support administration team. They'll deal with all inquiries for the TVP support teams, which you can find details about on the Venus Project's website. We'll have a TVP core and a TVP design administration team. Again, they'll deal with all inquiries that are forwarded from admin@thevenusproject.com, and they'll deal with all of those inquiries and forward them to the relevant project coordinators, etc. If you're interested in actually helping out with the emails and actually being part of the team dealing with that. Bear in mind, this is a you know it's quite a big job. It's pretty involved. You need to have a good understanding of the Venus Project and you know the concepts that we talk about. And you need to have a good, have a really helping kind of attitude, because a lot of people, we get various types of emails, everything from general inquiries to people that are depressed and want to kill themselves, and are looking for some kind of hope. It really does vary the kind of emails that we get. So you need to be quite an understanding person to deal with those and have the time available to do that. We're looking at possibly building up team anywhere up to 6 or 7 people per team, so that it limits the amount of time each person has to spend answering emails. So if you're interested in joining any one of these administration teams, please contact me at admin@thevenusproject.com, and we'll get you started with that. Obviously, one of the things that we'll be doing is a kind of test where you get a set of sample emails, and we'll see how you answer those. And then there'll be a short interview just to go over, the sort of details of each of these teams before we actually accept anyone onto them. So again, if you're interested in those, it's admin@thevenusproject.com. Just say which of the administration teams you'd be interested in joining, and we'll get going on that. Thank you very much. I'm going to shoot off now. I've got to make a call to Roxanne and chat to you all next week.
Thanks for coming, Andrew. Thanks for your help, Sean. And we'll see everybody next week, which is April 29th, 2012.
Thanks, Joe.